Okay, I want to take a minute and illustrate how literary and rhetorical criticism can help us, to gain some things in our study of New Testament books. I want to use Romans as an example for this one. The traditional reading of Romans finds a very stark contrast between the law and the freedom we have in Christ, law and grace. I think in our Protestant background, certainly that plays very large in our thinking and in our understanding. But there are some contradictions when you kind of look at it. When you start digging into Romans, you kind of make you think and wonder, why is it this way. Paul talks about when he talks about the law, he says that his concept seems to vary between the Torah given to Israel and something more like a principle of salvation or of moral law. And he assumes that the law is an undivided whole, and yet often seems to reduce it to just a moral law. And so, we even typically interpret that when we read Romans and think, oh, it's just a moral law. That means, either you follow it, or we don't want to be legalistic, that sort of thing. And so Paul says that both the law has been done away with, and that we must fulfill it as Christians. And so there seems to be this sort of two ways of thinking about the law as we look at the Romans on the surface. And even traditionally, there are lots of books and debates written about which way we should look at the law and what Paul's attitude about it is. On one hand, the law was written, as Paul says, to expose our sin all the more, to make it greater. And then on the other hand, the law is spoken about in a very positive light, and so it's difficult to understand what he's talking about now. But when we think about the rhetorical nature of the letter and some of the rhetorical devices that Paul uses, it helps us dig in a little more to understand some of these seeming contradictions and discrepancies, and we can understand them better. Now, in order to read Romans as a first century reader, we have to have some sense of some of the way that we've read this, and we do have to kind of accept that we do have a certain bias as we come to the text and kind of how we've heard things. And so I think it's important to consider that as we read and try to kind of step away from that for a moment to understand kind of what is going on. Paul wrote there are several techniques that he used. Dialogue exchanges, ring compositions, or basically ring composition is where you say one thing, and then there's another, and like say it's sort of a cyclical type of a argument. So you start with something, and you move to something else, something similar, and then go back to the original. So there's a circular nature to the conversation. So it's ring composition. He has various rhetorical figures, speaking character, and so on. I'll explain a few of those. So, for instance, in chapter 2, in verse 1, Paul depicts the hypocritical judge, okay, or maybe what you might call a pretentious moralist. This is actually a device from Hellenistic philosophical literature. The whole point, however, unfortunately, is lost to us because of chapter division. So when you read you take the chapters out and you read it straight, you understand you can see it a little bit better. But when you add the chapter divisions, it almost seems that Paul's just starting another thing. When in actuality, there's a device that's being used here, and so it's some of the questions that are asked. They are rhetorical. He's using a character who's kind of arguing with him, and he's arguing back, and that's how he writes some of the arguments in the letter. Speech in character is another rhetorical device. It's a technique in which the speaker or the writer produces speech that represents not himself or herself, but another person or type of character. And so Paul might write some things that are actually not his opinion. They're actually the opinion of the person he's arguing with. Now, you can understand that that's important to note when we're trying to understand the meanings of texts. And so if that device is being used, then the thing that's being said may not necessarily be what's being communicated to us. It might be quite the opposite. And so it's important to understand, or at least make a good stab at when he's using speech and character and when he's not. It's an exercise, well, actually, this was used quite often in Paul's time. In Paul's day, Judaism centered on a temple state with a hereditary priesthood whose religious system was constituted of a complex structure of purity and pollution relating to the temple and its animal sacrifice. So the definition of law for him and Jews and Gentiles have typically been given meaning by being placed in the context of our larger Christian theological construct, in which they play different roles from anything that was possible during Paul's time. For Paul, Jew and Gentile are ethnic categories, are not only ethnic categories, they also are his central religious distinctions. And so it is possible to distinguish ethnic from religious, or in our worldview, you might be, an American Muslim or American Christian. But for Paul, basically being Jew was being Jewish, and being Gentile was Gentile in every sense of the word, including religious. So our separation of church and state kind of muddies our thinking on this. That's not how Paul saw it. So they understood law as a religious, social, political, legal constitution of the Jewish people, and a basis both for the temple state in Judea as well as for the Jewish communities of the diaspora. And so for Paul, that's the law he's talking about. We as Christians read that and go, oh, he's talking about being legalistic. That's not what Paul's referring to in Romans, generally speaking, although there are applications, of course. You think about the shape of the letter of Romans. Romans tries to clarify, just kind of purpose-wise, he's trying to clarify for Gentile disciples their relationship to the law and to the Jews and Judaism in their current place in God's plan through Christ. Obviously, if you're looking at it through first century eyes and you're a Gentile, you're going to feel on the outside. How do we get on the inside? What is baptism enough? How do we connect? What's the plan here? Paul develops a strategy to persuade them that the righteousness they seek is to be found not in following Jewish teachers who advocate works of law, meaning the Judaic law, but in what God has done and is now doing. So he reroutes their security not in the Mosaic law, but in what God is now doing. And so in the introduction, he presents Christ and his faithfulness, how it's the key to understanding God's plan for dealing justly and successfully, both for the Jews and for the Gentiles and for the Greeks. He talks about, the sinful degradation. You guys all know Romans 1. You've read that many times, into which non-Jewish people have declined owing to their worship of many gods. And it kind of alludes back to Genesis 4 through 11. And God has punished them by allowing them their enslavement to passions and desires of their bodies. And so they live in societies characterized by evil and vice. And so then so this whole speech and character is used several times in chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, again in chapter 2, verse 17, through chapter 4, verse 22. Go back and read it again and think about it in terms of speech and character. The speech and character is this imaginary Gentile in chapter 2, verse 1. Who's warning him of his precarious situation in the present historical moment, and that God will judge both the Jew and the Gentile. And then in chapter 2, verse 17, there's an imaginary Jewish teacher who has taken it upon himself to teach the Gentiles to perform certain works from the law. The readers overhear a debate between Paul and this Jewish competitor for the hearts and minds of the Gentiles. And so again, when you read chapter 2 in that context, you can see how that rhetorical device works. And so I'd encourage you to go back and take a look at that here after you're done watching this video. God's way of putting Gentiles into right relationship through Christ's faithfulness is sharply distinguished from the message of the Jews who advocate works of law, or Torah. Given the teacher's own difficulty in keeping the law, how dare he presume to improve the Gentiles? That's kind of the argument Paul's making. And so moral betterment is not the answer. Just kind of making these Gentiles more more morally, making them morally better is not what Paul says is the answer. Of course, the answer is in Christ. In chapter 4, the teacher fades away. Paul speaks directly to the audience beginning in chapter 5. And in chapter 6 explains how this freedom from tyranny of sin works for Gentile readers. In chapter 8, Paul announces the good news that Christ and the Spirit have allowed release from enslavement and the condemnation of the law so that he can actually do what the law requires. And then in chapters 9 through 11, there's a warning against the Gentile presumption. Of course, by this point, if you're a Gentile, you're feeling pretty good about yourself. And there's a warning that in light of Israel's disbelief, that in the big picture, God chooses some and he rejects others for the sake of his larger purposes. It's not meant to be a statement of universalism, but rather a warning to the Gentiles not to get cocky just because the Jews are on the outs at the moment. And then in chapters 12 through the end of the book, he provides an exhortation of how righteousness should be lived out among them. That gives you a kind of a real quick sort of overview of how things are organized and a little bit of an insight into a few of the different rhetorical devices that are used in Romans. There are a lot of great books and commentaries out there that look at Romans from that perspective, and there are a lot of opinions out there. I just want you guys to be aware of just how rhetoric and how the letters are put together might influence how we understand what they're saying.